Hi, this is John Imperiale from GarageBandits.online with a new Rock and Roll Idols podcast. I'm here with two good friends and Beatle experts from the US, Lou Longobardi, and from Liverpool, author David Bedford. We're going to be talking today about David's new book, The Country of Liverpool, Nashville of the North, which looks at the influence of American country music on Great Britain, Liverpool, and the Beatles. Gentlemen, I love country music, and I certainly love the Beatles. So welcome, Lou. Welcome, David. And thank you for joining me today. Let's get started.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Nice to be here.
Great. So why don't we just get right into it? So, Lou, if you don't mind, pick up the ball, please.
Hello to everyone. And as John said, David Bedford, his book, The Country of Liverpool. And this book explores the impact of American country music on the UK, specifically in Liverpool, and the impact that country music had on the Beatles themselves, and then also some other local artists from the Liverpool area, particularly Phil Brady. So, David, what was the genesis gave you the idea of writing, this book on country music in Liverpool, or the impact that it has in Liverpool?
Well, I've always known that there was a huge country and western scene in Liverpool. We were known as the Nashville of the North within the UK back in the 60s. So while the Merseybeat scene was happening here, I already knew that there was a large country and western scene. But it's when my friend Gary Popper, who produced Looking for Lennon and co-wrote Finding the Fourth Beatle with me, he introduced me to Phil Brady. Now, Phil had formed his first country band in 1962, and he'd appeared in a film that Gary had made previously called The City That Rocked the World, which was retitled as Get Back, which tells the history of music in Liverpool. And so we were just chatting one evening, and he introduced me to Phil. And Phil said, he was telling me some of his story, which was fascinating in itself, but the fact that he'd kept and had a suitcase full of memorabilia throughout his career, newspaper clippings, flyers, tickets, all this kind of stuff. And he thinks it would make a good story. And I said, well, do you want me to tell your story? And he said, yeah, I'll bring the suitcase round. And I thought, an exaggeration. Anyway, I meet up with him, and he's got a small flight suitcase that you take in the cabin with you, chock-a-block full of photo albums. And there was a guy called Frank Nash, who was his fan club secretary. He put everything together in these albums. And it's just newspaper clippings, flyers, everything that Phil had told me. And it was just, for a historian like me who loves music, it was just a goldmine. So I'm looking at it and thought, well, I'm going to tell Phil's story. It's all there. It's brilliant. As I started talking to Phil and picking up the influences, I suddenly realizing that the whole beginning, the genesis, to use your word, Lou, of the country music scene in Liverpool was the same for the Beatles and for the beat groups as it was for the country groups. Because everything, when you track it back, goes through the skiffle craze, but then it goes back before then. And there's one artist whose name crops up all the time, no matter what form of music they went into, and that's Hank Williams. Everybody goes back to Hank Williams. And I started listening to the Hank Williams stuff, and the more you listen to that, the more I could hear where skiffle came from, where rock and roll in Britain came from, and the roots of the Beatles came from. So I was so interested to think, well, why do we have such a big country and western scene in Liverpool when we had this huge beat scene? Did they exist alongside each other? Did they coexist? Did they cross over? And so, as well as telling Phil's story, I wanted to get into why was this such a big country scene, the biggest in Europe, so we're told. Why did that happen in Liverpool? And what were the effects between the country music scene and the beat scene? So that sort of, it got me going. And as I do, as you know, with my other books, I start on something and I head off at tangents and I start joining bits and bobs together. And so 3 years later, I've come up with this. And that's what the title just leapt out at me, The Country of Liverpool. And it's not just the country music thing, but it picks up that attitude that the Liverpool people have. And Lou, as a frequent visitor, you'll know that, we see ourselves as a country in our own right. Geographically, we happen to be in England, in the UK. But Liverpool is like its own little nation all on its own. So it was that play on words. I thought, yeah, I've got to tell this story.
Okay. And you found some interesting things. Again, I said you wondered why it may have impacted the north, northwest England, Liverpool specifically. And in your research, you kind of found that there might have been something more than just American music coming into Britain, through the Cunard Yanks and bringing records. And there might have been something else that made it have such an impact, specifically in the north and in the northwest of Britain, than maybe just hearing records and liking records.
Yeah, there's lots of American connections with Liverpool. When I was doing the research for the Fab 104, my second book, I started talking to some of the local musicians, and they were talking about Burton Wood, which is this big Air Force base just outside Liverpool. 1942, US Air Force took it over, and it became the largest airfield in operation in the UK during the Second World War. And at its peak, there were nearly 20,000 US servicemen on there. And they were there right through the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And these guys, when they had downtime, were coming into Liverpool and they were going into the clubs. So there was a lot of Americans around in the clubs, and John, Paul and George in particular were hanging out with these guys. So there was one source of Americans coming in to Liverpool with their records. We then got the Cunard Yanks, as you mentioned, and these were the guys who were sailing from Liverpool over to New York in particular, but to Boston as well. And they were coming back with records. And there were so many merchant seamen from Liverpool that a lot of the musicians who came through in the 60s era had relatives or friends who were on these ships. And all these records were coming in. And I know we've talked in the past when you think about the rock and roll coming in, but they were bringing in, country music, a lot of country, a lot of the early R&B. There was jazz coming in. And then later on, we got some of that rock and roll was coming in as well. So you've got the musical influences coming through the records. But I was talking to a guy who's in Manchester, so just down the road, and he was doing some research on what were the influences on the Beatles generation on television and on the movie screens. And it turns out, when you dig into it, and he's done a lot of great research on this, they were all obsessed with the cowboy films. Now, there were so many different television series that you could watch. Saturday mornings, as we know from the recollections of the young Beatles, they were going to the local cinema, whether it's at the Walton Cinema up to the Abbey, just up from Penny Lane. They were going and watching the cowboy films. And they were absolutely obsessed with America. And so this guy, Gary, and I, we developed this concept of Liverpool as the final frontier, because we tended to look more across the Atlantic to America than down south to London. So we started putting all these different bits together. So you've got the music coming in. You've got Radio Luxembourg beaming in American music. You've got the American servicemen coming into the city. Suddenly, you've got this city of Liverpool, which has been tied to America with the shipping routes since the early 19th century, being Americanized. And if you read any of the interviews with the Beatles from their childhood, they will all tell you they were obsessed with everything American. And because the music was here, it was a natural place for country music to start up. But I went back further than that to pick up one of the points you said at the beginning, Lou. which was us picking up American music. Say, well, what actually are the roots of country music? And when you track it back through to the music from the Appalachian Mountains coming down, well, that music was music that had come from Great Britain to start with. So it's a lot of the folk songs, particularly the Scots and the Irish that had come over. So a lot of those traditional folk songs that had come over from the Pilgrim Fathers onwards, coming over to the US, that was what was coming down the Appalachian Mountains, and the first roots country that was being recorded. So many of those are old English folk songs, and it's a bit like we say with the Beatles. What the Beatles did was they took American rock and roll, put a Liverpool twist on it, and then sold it back to America. This is like the other way around. You've got British folk music, went out to America, you sold it back to us, and we tried to then sell it back again. So it was good fun, and every time you go back that little bit further, you're finding the roots of the Beatles, and this was all going on in the city, and we've got this real cosmopolitan mix of people here, and that's why country music in the UK was big in port cities, because that's where the music was coming in. So West Coast, East Coast, all the port cities, it was country music, none as big as Liverpool. And part of that, again, talking about was that the music that was coming back to us, a lot of it was the Irish music that had gone over. And of course, Liverpool is often referred to as the capital of Ireland, because we've got so many Irish people here. And so I spoke to a guy, Greg Query. Coincidentally, he lives in the same road as me. And he's written a fantastic book about the Irish in Liverpool. And talking to him about those Irish traditions, which is all about where you can see the country music coming from, which is the Irish folk music, which is acoustic. It's meeting in pubs. It's playing, it's getting around a piano, whatever instruments you've got, and singing. And again, apply that to the Beatles. And that's what, particularly Paul McCartney talks about, the great family parties. Of course, his mum's on the mowing side of the Irish. Ringo would always talk about the family parties. That was a big, big thing. And a lot of that is the Irish tradition. So it's one of those where I think you've got a perfect storm. All those elements, you stick them together. Country music was just a natural expression of the tradition of growing up in Liverpool.
Yeah, it's almost as if it was part of their DNA, uh, where the Irish music and Scott music that went to the colonies, and then became skiffle and became country western and all of that, and then came back, as you say, and then they kind of picked it up and put their other spin on it. So it's like one big circle, and familiarity was there because it was kind of in their roots. Well, they definitely did, whatever the reasons were. They definitely did have were influenced and did have a love for country music. I mean, Ringo talks about wanting to emigrate to Houston and not doing so, probably because of all the red tape, that he had to go through and the paperwork, and But the influence also, I don't think any of the others wanted to emigrate there, but they certainly put it in their music. And they were influenced in the songs they sang, picking up with the skiffle and picking up with the influences of the Everly Brothers and Chet Atkins and Hank Williams, and you can go back to many of the country artists, Jimmy Rogers, and they certainly put it into their music. They put it into the instruments that they selected. All of them wrote songs, in the line of country music. I mean, Ringo has "Don't Pass Me By," very countryish. Even "Octopus's Garden." John always talked about the Hank Williams and his song. My favorite Beatles country song is "I Don't Want to Spoil the Party," which is John's song, which is definitely influenced by country, and that's my favorite. Paul's "I'll Follow the Sun." George with "You Like Me Too Much," and there are others. You can go on, and I know you cover several, of the songs, many of the songs, in the books. Um, Also, their style of playing was also influenced by it, and Chet Atkins played a big role in George Harrison. Chet Atkins and Carl Perkins, played a big role, a big influence, in George, and specifically in his guitar playing, and again in the instruments that they chose, to play. So, I mean, I play guitar. I'm not a guitarist. John's a guitarist. He kind of knows the difference, the techniques. Yeah, but John's a guitarist.
No, I think my first recollection of guitar playing, Beatles guitar playing, was watching George on the Ed Sullivan Show. I started playing guitar when I was 7 years old, so I wasn't too old when the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan. But our idol in America before the Beatles, from a guitar play standpoint, was Chet Atkins. So my eyeballs popped out of my head when I see this young fellow from Liverpool playing a large body Gretsch Country Gentleman, 1962 Gretsch Country Gent, and who was the spokesman of Gretsch, but none other than Chet Atkins. So that was my first impression. My second impression, in the same video, was watching his right hand, where he was using essentially a hybrid picking. So he had his pick between his first finger and thumb, and then picking these other strings with his other fingers. And so that was my first recollection, and that, I think, is where you see that style. Another influence on George is James Burton, who played with Ricky Nelson and played with Elvis Presley, called the Master of the Telecaster, and again, it's that same style. But his signature style included what's called double stops, which are playing two strings in harmony to play some kind of melody. And George uses that throughout, his whole life. You see that, I guess, most memorably in "Words of Love," right? A Buddy Holly song, and George is playing double stops on the guitar. I'll just make one other comment on double stops. One of the most beautiful songs that I've heard from a double stop standpoint is "And Your Bird Can Sing," where George and Paul are playing double stops throughout the whole song in harmony, and it's a beautiful thing, and you can now see where that influence came from.
Because George, when he heard, I mean, obviously he was obsessed with Carl Perkins, as we know, and the Beatles were, they idolised him. It's when George was at the Liverpool Institute with a lad called Colin Manley, and Colin ended up playing with the Remo 4, and you can speak to just about any Merseybeat musician, and this includes Paul and George. Colin Manley was the top guitarist in Liverpool, and Colin taught George how to play that Chet Atkins style while he was still at school. And so that influence was there before they're officially the Beatles. While George is still at school, Colin is there, and he's teaching him that style. And Colin was just an absolute genius guitar player. There's some great stuff. I think you still find it on YouTube. Some great stuff filmed with the Remo when they were out in Hamburg, and he'd be playing the instrumentals. But he could play like Chet Atkins could. And George, as we know, was obsessed with the guitar. And if he could find somebody somewhere who could play something in a way he wanted, he went and he just soaked it up. And Colin Manley was that guy. And that's when Chet Atkins just became this idol. I mean, to the more, obviously Paul, and when he was in Nashville, he got together with Chet Atkins and stuff. They really looked up to him. And you can see that with those guitars of the Country Gent and the Tennessee. And Lou and I have been chatting about that recently, that those guitars with such a distinctive sound, and they just look so great. Not the easiest things to play.
I have a 1964 Country Gent, and you've got to lift weights to play that guitar. It's not the easiest guitar to get your arms around and play. and you never heard string swipes in George's playing. So he might have been using flat wound strings, which are a heavy gauge string, right? And they're harder to press. But I guess he was young and he had the strength in his hand to do that. The other thing that sticks out also on the guitar playing is in Act Naturally. That song is actually played in the key of G, and there George uses a drop D tuning. So he's using an alternate tuning to get that low bassy riff out of the guitar. He's tuning his last E string down a full step to a D, and that's how he gets that wonderful sound. Plus, being played on the country gent just makes it sound all the much better.
I think Act Naturally may not, they never know. The country gent and the Tennessean, he was kind of using both. But when they got into 1965, George went heavy into the Tennessean. So, in fact, even, the album that's sort of the Beatles country album, which was Beatles for Sale. And for us here in America, it was a combination of Beatles 65 and then Beatles 6, which came, early in 65. Um, he had switched a lot to the Tennessean by that time. Seems like he had it as early 64, used it in France, but didn't use it at all in America or any of the tours that they did in 64. But then he brought the Tennessee, he used the country gent then. But then at the end of 64, it seems, I'm going by the pictorial history now. You can see him using it at the end of 64. And he definitely used it during the sessions of Beatles 6, Beatles 6 and Beatles 65. And then he started using it on stage, and he's most known for it in 1965, where he did take it on the American tour, used it at Shea. It showed up in the Help movie, but a lot of the books that you read, they'll tell you that he had both of those guitars, at the sessions, and they never really know. They can't tell you exactly which one he used, whether he used the gent or the Tennessean. So, you may be right. He may have played that on the. But if you listen to if you watch the Ed Sullivan Show in '65, where Ringo did do that live, and even in Blackpool a few weeks earlier in England, George, that was the tour he was using the Tennessean on. So I'll leave that up to you to determine whether that was the same guitar he used on record. But one of the things about George that, and the Beatles really, that I think was very interesting, they talk about having their own sound and having mixed sounds together. And I think it was that mixture of George's country influence, even though the others were country. George's leads were always very countryish. It was not one of those blues guitar leads. They were always countryish. And even when the Beatles and John and Paul weren't writing songs that were country songs, George would put that country lead into it. An example that I think, All My Lovin', I don't think in the verses is necessarily a country song, but you have George put that lead in, and all of a sudden it's a country lead, and they melded those two, pop and country, together. Even something as hard as and as bluesy as "She's a Woman," in the guitar solo part, it becomes a country song. George's guitar playing in that solo becomes country. So that mixture of throwing country music, into blues or into plastic blues, or whatever you want to call it, plastic soul, or even pop music, I think that played a big factor in making what became called, Beatle music. And maybe it was the same way even with Mersey Beat. Maybe the other, I remember even hearing Jerry Marsden from Jerry and the Pacemakers on an interview once, and what influenced him. And the song that he played, he had a guitar with him, and the song he played was Jambalaya. And so there definitely was this influence of country among all of the bands that came out of Liverpool. So I think that Mersey sound was, a lot of it was that, bringing in the country music element into pop, rock, blues, rhythm and blues. But they introduced that country element.
And Jerry used the Tennessean.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were saying just before about it being in their DNA, because there's so many of the Merseybeat musicians who've talked about their roots, and majority of them have come through skiffle. But it must be the first time I listened to Move It On Over by Hank Williams. Now, if you listen to Move It On Over, which came out was it late 40s? I mean, it's Rock Around the Clock. Rock Around the Clock is almost the identical melody and everything. This was coming out at the end of the 40s.
Right. And I know this from reading it in your book. I read that and I went back. I had never heard Moving On Over. And well, I think I had heard it, but I didn't know it. And when I heard it, I said, wow, this is the same song. This is just a straight lift of, of Moving On Over from, Rock Around the Clock. So
If you think Hank Williams was, he was the artist that more of the kids in Liverpool had than anybody else was Hank Williams. And when I was doing the book with Michael Hill, and he wrote his book, John Lennon, the Boy Who Became a Legend, and I was helping him get it published. Of course, Michael was a good friend of John's, and John would borrow a lot of records off Michael. And Michael can still remember them, and it's like 6 or 7 Hank Williams records that John borrowed off Michael because John was obsessed with Hank Williams. And so when, like, I was talking to Rod Davis from the Quarrymen, and he said it before, but it sort of really clicked when I was doing this research. He said, once we learn those first 3 chords for playing skiffle, and we'll talk about what skiffle is in just a moment, he said those 3 same chords played country music, and those 3 same chords played rock and roll. And so I wanted to go back into what were the Quarrymen playing. So I've tried to put as an extensive a list as I can together of songs from their repertoire. And you think of some of the artists we've talked about already. When you're talking Elvis, who of course was the hillbilly cat when he started out. Buddy Holly, roots are in country. Roy Orbison, Carl Perkins. All these guys, their roots are in country music. I mean, Carl Perkins, of course, doing like the rockabilly, doing that bit of a crossover, which they liked. But skiffle music, when you take it back, was really Lonnie Donegan kicking things off in this country. This craze at the beginning of 56. But Lonnie Donegan, a fascinating interview that he did years ago, and he was down in London, and he became interested in Woody Guthrie. And he realised that if you went to the American Embassy in London, they had a part of the Library of Congress in there, and he was borrowing Woody Guthrie songs. Now you go listening to Woody Guthrie, and you hear Lonnie Donegan and skiffle. So you start thinking, you just need to go back a couple of steps, and suddenly you realise where skiffle, as we called it, has come from. And skiffle is this hybrid of a bit of the old British folk music, American folk, American roots of country, all these things put together. And that's what skiffle became. And a light bulb moment for me was when I found one of those very early Quarrymen business cards, which is going to be on the cover of the book. And it says the Quarrymen, country, western, skiffle, rock and roll. So right at the beginning of the Quarrymen's career, they're saying one of the styles of music they perform is country and western. So it was all there, all in the skiffle mix. And what turns out what happened was a lot of the skiffle groups became rock and roll groups, but others became country groups. And there's interest. One of the bands that there are 3 main Liverpool artists. There's Phil Brady as the main guy. Then there's the Hillsiders and Hank Walters and the Dusty Road Ramblers. And the Hillsiders, they recorded out in Nashville. They were a huge top British act. And they were originally Sonny Webb and the Cascades, who were known as a beat group. As the Beatles started becoming big, they were thinking, right, we've got a choice. Do we follow the Merseybeat route, or do what we love, which is country? And I said, no, we're going to do country. Now, again, they managed to do that slight crossover with it. But from then, the Hillsiders were an out-and-out country group, and one of the best around. And it was fun, we're talking with Phil Brady and other musicians from the time. When there was a night at one of the clubs that the promotion was on, and he'd have a number of bands on, that would be a mixture of beat groups and country groups. That they would share the stage. They share a lot of the songs as well. So that's sort of, again, where we're looking at where you get the country, the Mersey sound from. They were all doing a mixture of it's the country, it's R&B, it's rock and roll, it's rockabilly, and they're mixing it all together and competing with each other. So you had to be able to do a bit of everything to get hired again for the next time.
There's one other thing that I noticed, that I looked into after reading your book, and which I know isn't out yet, but you've been kind enough to have us see a bit of it. And one of the things that it made me look into and reminded me is a song that I realize now was probably my first country song that I ever heard. And I got to go back to when I was about 8 years old. And I think I liked it more for the yodeling and everything else that was in it. But there was a song by a group called the Fendermen. And it was a Jimmy Rogers song called Mule Skinner Blues. Does everybody remember that song? John, you might remember it.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
I realized when I was looking into it, I saw after reading your book, which I'm not sure if it mentioned it in any of the sections that I said, but it reminded me of that. So I looked at it and I saw that first of all, it was Jimmy Rogers who wrote it, and who George even brings up in the anthology as someone, and the anthology brings up as someone that was an influence. And it also mentioned that I also noticed that it's been covered by a ton of people. And I listened to the original by Jimmy Rogers, and it's not anywhere near what the Fenderman did with it. And I listened to Dolly Parton, and I listened to a few others, and everybody seems to, do what they want with that song. But one of the things that really struck me was something that the Beatles used to say, when they were lacking a drummer. It's very well known that they were always, lacking a drummer. And they used to say, the rhythm's in the guitar. And when I was listening to that record, I actually found a YouTube video where the two artists who did that song performed it as older men in, looks like it was a radio station, and they did it, and they didn't need anything but the two of them and their guitars. They didn't have drums in that song. If you listen to that song, and if you listen to it, especially if you look at the YouTube video of these two guys playing it, you'll see they didn't need drummers. They didn't need a drummer. They played the guitar as a percussion instrument. And, I think we've talked about this a bit when you were doing the Fifth Beatle, that you had people who were sort of guitar drummers. They were kind of playing a drum, a percussion, on their guitars, as John kind of does in All My Lovin'. He adds it's sort of like a percussion in it. It's so prominent, and there are other songs. Even What Goes On is another one where John's rhythm guitar. You have George's going with the lead, but John's rhythm guitar very choppy and very percussive. And it always leads me back to that thought. Even though they were using it as an excuse, they didn't need it. It kind of was true. The rhythm was a lot in the guitar. And as much as they obviously needed a drummer, there are some songs, and I don't know if it's true in all of country music, because I'm not really a big country music fan, and I certainly don't know a lot of country music songs. But just that one song, my first introduction to it with the Fendermen and Mule Skinner Blues, I'm not sure there's even a drummer playing on that song. And if you watch the YouTube video, you'll see the guy basically playing the drums on his rhythm guitar. So it's a fascinating, part of it, that this first song I had, I think, kind of lends into that, the rhythms in the guitars. And I think that was another thing about Beatles music that might have been different from others in American music, where they had a drummer, but I think they also had guitarists who were, again, very country. And I think because of that, there might have been some rhythm that was built into the guitar playing that at times they may not have needed a drummer. So it's just an interesting thing that I found out, since it brought me back to the first song that I ever remember, except for maybe the Ballad of Davy Crockett. That was probably my first country song. But, after that, the first country record I ever bought was Mule Skinner Blues. So probably back in 1960, 61.
Well, I think it's an interesting thing because the way skiffle started, the Quarrymen were unusual because they had Colin Hanton and they had a drummer. Not many skiffle groups did. And the reason why country music was so popular and why skiffle was so popular to start with was normally when you go to roots country, drums don't appear. Hank Walters and his Dusty Road Ramblers, he really did not want a drummer in his group, and he resisted it for years because it's an acoustic music and you had to make that with the instruments you've got. And the reason why there were so many country groups was there were so many pubs in Liverpool where the whole communities would meet up, and that's where country music had the advantage over rock and roll, because you can't go in, with the amplifiers, electric guitars and stuff. It wasn't communal. The beat music was a performance. Country music and folk music has always been really big in Liverpool as well. And it comes down to what is country music, and there are so many elements, you can't define it. There's so many different strands and genres within country music. The great thing about it was it's really an acoustic style of music, and it lends itself to community singing, to places where people are gathering, whether it's in a pub, in a social club, wherever. All you need is your acoustic guitar. And yeah, once you learn those different styles, you are a mixture of, you're the percussion and you're the rhythm and you're the music. And that was the great thing. And that's why country music was so popular and still is popular, as folk music is, because you could take it absolutely anywhere. And you could go to virtually any pub in Liverpool back then, and there would be somebody with a guitar.
Yeah, well, that's the way, those other two guys up there, they'll tell you back in our college days, we would get together and we'd decide whether the party was going to be what we call the hootenanny. And if it was going to be a hootenanny, we would bring our guitars and we'd bring our acoustic guitars, and that would be it. And of course, you're not going to carry drums around, but even if you did, um, being an acoustic genre of music, the drums are too loud. So it almost shows that you had to. Even Colin used to stay a little bit. If you look at his pictures, he stayed a little bit. I mean, the drummers were always in the back, but he sort of put himself off to the side so that I guess you could still hear the guitars and he wouldn't where that was coming from, all the other instruments. So there definitely is something to the acoustic roots of Beatles music, and country music that puts a different type of rhythm guitar playing, into the mix. So the other interesting thing that I found was, we talked about everything coming full circle, and you mentioned actually in your research that you found that I guess when there was the supercontinent of Pangea, and when all the land masses were together, Ireland and the eastern coast of the United States were together, and then when they split off, I guess some of the mountain ranges split also, and I guess the Appalachian Trail not only goes up the Appalachian Mountains in the east coast of the U.S., but it now officially, they must have found something that you've got to go, if you want to walk the Appalachian Trail, you have to go to Ireland.
Yeah, it's funny that when I was just researching the whole thing with the Appalachian people, and I came across this thing with the Appalachian Trail, and I just realizing that the geology of the mountain ranges and stuff in the Appalachian Mountains was absolutely identical to what you find on the west coast of Ireland, and proving that they did used to be one landmass. And so it's a leap and stuff, but is it any surprise that it was the music, particularly of Ireland and the Scots and Irish, that makes it to the Appalachians? But again, like you were saying just now, you're going to a hootenanny. Now, what's a hootenanny? That's a Scottish party.
I never knew that.
New Year's Eve, when we have a New Year's Eve party in Scotland, they have a hootenanny for singing the New Year. So you're part Scottish, Lou?
The book, as I say, you can talk about the Beatles, you can talk about all the songs. We, love to do that. But there's so many stories, as you say. You go into that in the book. You cover the roots of it. You cover the Beatles aspect of it. You cover the the local artists, the Phil Brady's and Hank Walters, I believe it was, and and others and many others. And it's I haven't gotten through the entire book, but I've gotten through much of it, and it's really fascinating and very enlightening. If you're interested, especially for someone who is not very familiar with country music, as I was not. It's really enjoying, everything that I'm reading, and encourage everybody to go out and buy David's book, The Country of Liverpool. And when do you think it's going to actually be out?
And the plan is, I mean, everything's got put on hold, obviously, with the COVID pandemic. But I'm just waiting on. And my plan is to have 2 forwards to the book, because it's very much is this idea, and we may be able to physically do, is to twin Liverpool with Nashville. That there are so many of the links with the cities, with the artists, that was seriously trying to get that off the ground. So I'm having one forward written by a country star from Nashville, and then over here we've got a guy called Kevin McManus, who's the head of the UNESCO World Heritage Music for Liverpool. That's his job, and he'd been researching country music for years. So I'm just waiting for those to come in. Everything else is ready to go. So as soon as I've got that, I'm hoping next month, October, that it'll be ready. So it can be pre-ordered at the moment. So I've got a website, which is theCountryofLiverpool.com. And you go on there and you can sign up for updates. A number of people have pre-ordered. We're doing a limited edition, a numbered signed edition, and then there'll be on general release as well.
Sorry, I have one last question for you, and it's regarding outlaw country. And that was a movement that happened here that took some rock and roll stars such as Waylon Jennings and Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson, and actually took them outside of Nashville. Did you come upon anything regarding outlaw country?
It was just, I mean, I've always been a Johnny Cash fan. My dad was a Johnny Cash fan. I think it's the only music my father and I had in common. After that, he was into light entertainment and Tijuana brass and all kinds of stuff. But Johnny Cash has always been a favourite. And yeah, it was interesting because when Phil Brady was on tour, particularly in the 60s, he toured with all the big stars, Slim Whitman, Buck Owens, and Willie Nelson. And a couple of the photos I've got in the book of Willie Nelson, you would not recognise him. Because back then, in the late 60s, clean shaven, neat haircut, in a suit. You know, you had to look at it, and I had to be convinced by Phil and saying, is this really him? And he said, yeah, this is him. I said, it's amazing. And I sent some photos over to Willie Nelson's granddaughter, who's becoming a star in her own right. And I sent him and said, I don't know if you've ever seen these before. This is what he used to look like. And she was just gobsmacked. Because with Chet Atkins stuff, they were putting forward this Nashville sound. But of course, Willie Nelson, like a number of others, were Texas. And they decided to break away from Nashville. And so suddenly Willie goes from this clean-shaven, smart suit, neat haircut guy to this raggedy outlook. And it was a fabulous way of finding something. They just had to break free. And in a way, it's sort of a bit like the country artists in Liverpool had to do to break off the shackles of the Beatles and Mersey Beat. They had to be seen as something different. And they found that in country music and had a good career in it. And yeah, so to what country music, it's been through lots of different phases of being popular, being unpopular. It's not cool to like it, yet it is. And I sort of covered this at the end of the book with 2 stories. One with one of my daughters, Lauren, who got into country music through my sister Judy, and she's still a huge country fan. She's not officially a stalker, but she's followed Taylor Swift all over UK, met her a few times and stuff. She loves her country music, and it's when there's like this it's almost like a crossover. So it's gone to this next stage where you listen to sort of the modern country music. It's not far away from rock and roll. And some people like to be purists, some like different ways. And I think what Willie Nelson with the outlaw stuff, particularly with the Highwaymen, what they were doing, it's that lovely hybrid of country with a bit of rock music in there as well. And then sort of country music's never really been seen to be that cool in Britain. And yet there's a huge underground movement. And over the last few years, Bob Harris, who's a legendary broadcaster of the BBC since the early 70s, he's been championing country music. And there's now a number of festivals, and there's a huge one called Country to Country, which now takes place in London, in Dublin and Glasgow every year. And there's events happen the same weekend, and the artists go between the three locations, and it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the last guy I interviewed for the book, Dominic Halpin, he has his roots in that 50s and 60s music, which he's always loved, and put together a show, a country night in Nashville, which has been touring for nearly 3 years now. And it sells out right across the UK. And he's picking some of those bits of country music from all different genres, a couple of his own stuff. And the show is unbelievable. It's massive. And he's done an album called 4,000 Miles, which is how far it is from his house to Nashville. Recorded an album out there. And country music is big again in Britain. It goes through these cycles, but it's becoming really, really big and very, very popular again. And it's one of the things that the way I look at popular music from the 50s onwards, there's different things that come and go. We've had electronic music, we've had punk, we've had all kinds of stuff going on. Guitar-based music has always been there. It's been a constant. And that's when you try and get into defining what country music is. It's almost impossible. It's almost impossible, but it covers so much.
Yeah, like defining it, also distinguishing one part from the other. There's country and Western. And can either of you, John or Bob or David, in your research and your listening and your learning, what's the distinction? Have you come across the distinction between country and Western? The Nashville sound versus the West Coast Bakersfield sound, and Buck Owens. And is there any distinctive difference between Nashville and, say, the Bakersfield sound?
It's Western swing is what it was. And Western swing combined with country became country and Western. So its full title would be country and Western swing. So that is more of the stuff you'd see in the cowboy films, Roy Rogers, etc., with it, the songs they were singing along to, with that swing in there. So it's a bit of a jazz influence in there, which goes down a different route to the more pure country music. So it's got that, which has more of that, the Appalachian style, going back to the folk music bit. So it was the Western swing is what really made the difference between the two. And some would stick rigidly to purely country and Western. Others would say, I'm not touching the Western, I'm just doing country. But then country includes blues. It includes some rock and roll. It includes bits of all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, I think the first thing you see in country Western is a heavy influence of the steel guitar, real heavy, twangy steel guitar.
We've spoken a lot about country music, the influences on the instruments and the rhythms and the music itself, but vocally, what was the influence and of country music on the Beatles, Mercy Beat, rock, the rock scene in general? What vocally did they pick up from country music?
I think one thing that a lot of country music is well known for are their close harmonies. You go back to the very beginning. Look at the Carter family. When they were first recording back in the 20s, harmonies have been very, very important in country music. And when you fast forward a bit to the fledgling groups like the Quarrymen turning into the Beatles, etc., then I know Paul McCartney has often said that when you think of the Everly Brothers in particular, that heavily country influenced, Paul has said that, at times he and John wanted to be Don and Phil. They wanted to be the Everly Brothers. And I think when you listen to Two of Us, I think is the perfect example of the Beatles doing the Everly Brothers. What the Beatles were able to do is take it on that next step and make it the Everly triplets, because you had the 3-part harmony. And that's what really made the Beatles stand out amongst the others. Most other groups had a lead singer and others who could back them up. With the Beatles, you had 3 lead singers who could take it in turns, but you could do those 3-part harmonies. And that lent itself very much to what country music has always been well known for, which is doing those harmonies. So you can certainly see the Everly Brothers and saying that, and Paul definitely said, that's what they wanted to be. Standing up there, they wanted to be the Everly Brothers. They looked up to them, they listened to them, and they were certainly influenced by them. And I think a lot of the Liverpool groups, they were influenced by all of those great artists we've talked about before. But if you want to go for the country and the harmony bit, then you look straight at what the Everly Brothers were doing. They're brilliant.
Yeah, their 2-part harmonies, and you can almost. I don't think they ever did it, but I would have loved to have heard the Everlys sing "If I Fell." I think that would have been a nice song to have heard them do. And yeah, they when they brought it into the 3-part harmonies, even you can make a case that Yes It Is has a country feel to it, a bit more than the 3-part harmonies they did in This Boy. I think Yes It Is a little bit more, has a little bit more of that country feel, and that was around the time that they were really getting into that country stuff. And of course, in their solo careers, Paul visiting Nashville, Ringo doing a duet with Buck Owens, all of which you cover somewhat extensively, especially Paul going to Nashville, I should say, not New Orleans, Nashville, in the book, and then eventually penning a song, for the Everly Brothers themselves in 1984 on the Wings of a Nightingale. And that must have just been the thrill of a lifetime for Paul to be able to write a song for the Everly Brothers to sing.
The book is The Country of Liverpool, Nashville in the North. Let's look out for that when that's released. Thank you, gentlemen. I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for listening. So until next time.